On the limits of limited rationality. Economics had this approach where they would just say every agent tries to do the rational thing and therefore optimize towards getting the most utility. And since everybody's rational, this then leads to exchange to the invisible hand, coined by Adam Smith. But in the recent years, a couple of books have come out, maybe also a couple of papers, but I haven't read these papers. I only read the books or listened to them. One of these books, System 2 and System 1 Thinking, or rather Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Then there is Richard Taylor, also a popular economist, who also wrote books about the limited or the limits of rationality. Now, recently I actually read another book, which was called How Minds Make Societies, which again goes into a different direction. Now, in my own life and my thinking of myself as kind of an agent that tries to now optimize the life or the utility of time in this case, mostly I think, I then often, first of all, this concept of the limit rationality then often kind of gave me not necessarily an excuse, but it allowed me to recognize that in some areas so what it allowed me to do is to just say, okay, I am to a certain extent, or my behavior to a certain extent is the outcome of the systems I rely on. So if I happen to be exposed to sweets, for example, then I just don't stand any chance with whatever the rest is defined to withstand these sweets over time, let's just say. Now, on the limits of limited rationality again, this last book here, How Minds Make Societies, again made the point for the case, or made the case that most decisions, or many decisions, are actually kind of computations. And now, I think the rationality, the limits on rationality is kind of the idea that many of the things that you think that you can influence are actually beyond the influence. And what you is then usually referred to is as by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky defined System 2 thinking. So you thinking as yourself, but then the rest of you, your subconscious, then also does calculations. For example, it constantly calculates how fast my heart should beat and then adapts the beating rate of the heart, or rather the heart just beats as fast as it kind of would be optimal. At least I assume this is somewhat what my heart is doing. The same goes for my breathing rate. The same goes for my body temperature. The same goes for my digestion. All these things, if I overtook them or try to overtook them with the respiration, I could actually try to overtake it. I could say, okay, I now want to say for a given workout, let's just say a resistance training in the gym, I know I have this respiratory rate, and with this other thing, I have this respiratory rate. I would have to collect data. I would have to make correlations. I would maybe have to have a giant Excel sheet that then would define the different breathing rates for different activities. But what then if I start to jump in mid-air, for example, or I run up a hill, or what if a saber-toothed tiger appears in front of me? How does then the slope of my respiratory rate also influence basically how effective then my respiratory rate is with providing my body then at the right point in time with oxygen? So the one could say that the first generation of limited rationality went basically try to defy the assumption of economics prior, that the rational agent as us, the rational agents basically, as the people, so as the minds we identify with are kind of limited, and maybe things can be explained basically with things that lie beyond our control. Like the famous, okay, you see something flicker on screen in cinema, and it might be an ad for popcorn or something like this, even though I think the study turned out to be faked. Nonetheless, that there are these factors which you don't really have access to, or the calculation basically is beyond. The calculation might be bigger basically than what you have access to, and you cannot influence this calculation. So you might not go to the grocery store and decide rationally to buy sweets, but you nevertheless buy sweets. Now the question is, why do you buy sweets? Now the limited rationality approach would say it's because you're acting not rational. But if you then also include basically system 1 as basically the thinking we cannot really control, the heuristics we rely on, and basically to a certain extent, at least in my eyes, the subconscious, at least from reading all of these books and kind of just trying to simplify and summarize now, then this is still a calculation. And the calculation is then overtaken by the subconscious, and it is overridden. So basically the system 2 calculation is overridden by the system 1 calculation whenever system 1 thinks it is actually more useful. When I try to drive and my eyes begin to fall, then system 1 is trying to override basically my attempts of system 2 thinking by overriding, because it thinks in the long term it is a better strategy to now try to sleep, because otherwise I might get, for example, I don't know what will happen, but I will not be able. System 1 in this case is basically saying, okay, the machine we are running is no longer running in the next couple of minutes if we now don't shut it down. The machine is overheating, even though in this case it's not overheating but undersleeping. But if you have a train and the machine in there is overheating, so let's say it's a locomotive engine, and we need to shut the engine down right now because otherwise it will explode, then this is an override request. And the override request gets basically more and more intense until it actually is able to override basically our willpower. And so if one takes into account this newer thinking, which happened maybe, so this recent book I listened to, How Minds Make Societies, happened to be one example that kind of fits into this other thinking, that system 1 is also making constantly calculations, and maybe we would just need to include this. So therefore also the economic calculation again. Now the problem with the economic calculation is, or the economic prior assumption of kind of basic economics, that every agent acts rationally, then does no longer really apply at first at least. But if we, for example, just say animals also do what is rational to a certain extent, even though they're not trying to override their rationality or the subconscious rationality with system 1, with system 2 thinking, they are still acting rationally, and therefore they have to because they have constrained resources and they are acting upon these constrained resources, and if they don't, they eventually die out, or rather their genes are basically erased from the gene pool because others are better competition, one could say. Now, if one combines these two approaches, then one could say, to a certain extent, our actual rationality, what we think of as rationality, as system 2 thinking, might be limited. But it is only limited to the extent at which evolution did basically exclude this limitation from the evolutionary optimization, and therefore it might also be included in actually system 1 thinking, which then also, if one applies a rationality to the overall actions of somebody, then it would again say, okay, this is actually rational, at least for the entity, for the overall entity, which is in this case a human. If I go to the grocery store and I still have this rule in me that says eat as much fat and sugar as I possibly can, even though this might just be very simplified, then this is still basically a rational approach, because it is a rule that was implemented. Of course, the rule itself is not necessarily always the thing that is the closest. So the rule is only a heuristic. A heuristic has the big advantage that it does not need to include all of the variables, but it includes basically only the most important ones. So therefore it is a model. It is a simplifying rule. In this case, a model basically cuts out all the variables that are ideally, if the model is proper, if it is a good model, that are not that important, and includes only the main variables, also depending on how simple one wants to get the model. So one of these models that then happens to be a kind of rule to a certain extent at least, again simplified by language, would be to eat as much sugar and fat as one possibly can, and therefore whenever I go to the grocery store, I then might be incentivized by my subconscious to actually buy this thing, even though I rationally could say that in the long term, according to the data, that seems to be evident that, and also maybe my own experience, it seems to be evident that it is not that useful to get these foods, even though they seem to also to a certain extent make sense. So therefore I am kind of making a calculation. I kind of am playing against my subconscious, and my subconscious is playing against me. And maybe there are things also in between these two. Of course, Now, one could say thoughts are just marginally less conscious and then maybe a little bit more conscious, similarly to how some animals might be a little conscious and then a little bit more conscious, and then they might be a monkey, and then the monkeys might be a little bit more conscious. It's instead of saying, okay, humans are conscious, but the Homo erectus was not conscious, for example.